Hello and welcome to the last lecture of the NPTEL course Postmodernism in Literature. In today's session, we hope to be able to do a quick recap of our discussions in the last few weeks and also begin asking these questions about the relevance of discussions related to postmodernism in the contemporary. Much as it is difficult to frame conclusions to a topic as diverse as postmodernism, here we begin to attempt the same. When we talk about postmodernism in the contemporary, it is also important to ask whether there was an expiry date assigned for this period. Many critics have spoken about the beginnings, the starting points of postmodernism, which would also perhaps logically expect us to assume that there is an end point, there is an expiry date to this movement which began in the post-Second World War period. And many have also raised this question about whether the postmodern period is already over and whether we are living in a period which comes after postmodernism. And if that is the case, it's also important to ask what comes after postmodernism, given that postmodernism itself is a phenomenon which came into being after modernism. And these are certain challenging questions, and these are certain pertinent realities that we also need to deal with in a discussion related to postmodernism. And I take you through a set of critics who have asked these questions, and I leave you with no answer. You may recall how Terry Eagleton and some other Marxist critics such as Jameson also argued that postmodernism is a passé and it's a phase that is finished. And they also looked at postmodernism as a failure and as an illusion and refused to engage with it, given that it is also a product, an offshoot of the capitalist advanced societies. And Linda Hutcheon, one of the foremost theorists of postmodernism, she also came up with this argument in her introduction to her 2002 work titled Politics of Postmodernism, and she very poignantly suggested that it's over, that the postmodern phase is over. And this is how she builds up her argument. I read to you an excerpt from the Politics of Postmodernism. Postmodernism in both fiction and photography could be said to have been born of the particular confrontation between realist referentialism and modernist reflexivity, between the historical and the parodic, or the documentary and the intertextual. But this particular confrontation ended in a typically postmodern truce. No either or decision was required. The more inclusive both and prevailed. We also saw in our earlier discussions how the privileging of both and over either or was always seen as a celebratory intervention that postmodernism made. And Linda Hutcheon and many others have also pointed out how this move from the realist modernist phase towards the postmodern phase, where they challenged the truths about knowledge, about history, about identity, it was found to be more conducive than the limiting rigid frameworks that modernity had offered, that enlightenment, that post-enlightenment period had offered. While this is seen as a reason to celebrate, while this could be seen as more liberating and more enlivening in comparison to the rigid narratives of modernity, there are also certain limitations inherent in this rejection of the grand narratives, because it is not conducive for identity politics. Linda Hutcheon takes this point forward, and she also argues that very inclusivity, which was the catchphrase of postmodernism, it also became the mark of its potentially complicitous critique and the beginning of the problems identity politics would have with the postmodern. We also noted how the postmodern as a category did not really gel well with at least some of the feminists, and we also saw how work such as Jeanette Winterson's Written on the Body could not really be seen as postmodern, because she was also engaging with identity and issues related to the self. And these sort of limitations also made postmodern not a viable category for practicing certain kinds of political subjectivities. Brian McHale, another theorist of postmodernism who's been oft quoted, he wrote a 2007 paper titled What Was Postmodernism? The past tense used in McHale's paper was very telling. It also drew a lot of attention from the academic circles. He chose to look back on the movement from 2007, and his paper also implied that whatever was designated, whatever was described as postmodern, it was already over. That phase had already come to an end. And he also used certain phrases from Thomas Pynchon's recent novel Against the Day, and used phrases such as living on after the end and end of the world as we know it, to talk about a certain period which was post the experience of 9/11 tragedy. McHale also argued that whatever descriptions which had fit the category of postmodernism, it had ceased to make sense after a certain point in history. And he also was one among those critics who argued that if postmodernism had a starting point, it also had to have a definite point in history where it would also come to an end. Another significant intervention in this regard was the 1989 essay by Alison Gibbons. It appeared in the Times Literary Supplement, and the essay was titled "Postmodernism is Dead. What Comes Next?" Gibbons made this very powerful argument that the forces that once drove postmodernism seem now to be depleted, however. And in the place of postmodernism, Gibbons also argued that in place of postmodernism's cool detachment and its anthropomorphism, realism had once again become the popular mode. If you recall some of our discussions in the previous sessions, we made it very clear that postmodernism always made it deliberate to move away from the conventions of realism. Even while realist techniques were used, it was only to subvert certain historical artifacts related to realism and its narrative techniques. And here we have Gibbons arguing that realism is once again becoming a popular mode because postmodernism has been again, in a sense of cyclical history, been replaced by realism. And he also pointed out that in this process a new dominant cultural logic was emerging, and the world, if not the entire world, at least he says the literary cosmos, was rearranging itself. And it's important then to ask when and why these moves and these shifts happened, the move away from the postmodern moment. Taking off from Alison Gibbons' essay, certain other critics have asked about what made such a move pertinent, a move away from postmodernism. And many have given a diverse set of characteristics, a diverse set of historical events, and some of the important ones being the fall of Berlin Wall, which happened in 1989, the new millennium, which also brought in a set of new changes along with it, the 9/11 attacks, which really changed the current defining political elements and also brought in newer kinds of identity crisis, and the so-called war on terror, which is still ongoing, the ongoing wars in the Middle East, the financial crisis which had erupted in different parts of the world, and also global revolutions to which the world still does not seem to have any kind of resolution. And more things are being cited, such as the failure and unevenness of global capitalism, which incidentally even the Marxist critics had pointed out in their discussions on postmodernism, and also the disillusionment with the project of the neoliberal postmodernity. Just like a sense of disillusionment had come in at the wake of modernity with the disillusionment with the Enlightenment projects, we find a similar kind of happening in the turn of the century. And the political splintering of the entire political world into extreme left and extreme right also had led to the aggravation of this sense of disillusionment. And some of them also talk about the hyper-anxiety which the 24-hour news has brought about. It is in this context that a recent article by Alan Kirby, published in 2006, titled "The Death of Postmodernism and Beyond," assumes a special significance. Kirby talks about what gets to replace postmodernism, and he argues in its place comes a new paradigm of authority and knowledge formed under the pressure of new technologies and contemporary social forces. Accordingly, he also refers to a world that he prefers to call as pseudo-modern. This has also been known as the digi-modern world. He talks about the pseudo-modern world dominated by the powers of internet, and he also goes on to argue towards the end of his paper, the pseudo-modern world, so frighteningly and seemingly uncontrollable, inevitably feeds a desire to return to the infantile playing with toys which also characterizes the pseudo-modern cultural world. Here the typical emotional state, radically superseding the hyper-consciousness of irony, is the trance, the state of being swallowed by your activity, in place of the neurosis of modernism. and the narcissism of postmodernism. Pseudomodernism takes the world away by creating a new, weightless nowhere of silent autism. You click, you punch the keys, you are involved, engulfed, deciding. You are the text. There is no one else, no author. There is nowhere else, no other time or place. You are free. You are the text is superseded. This is the pseudo-modern world that Alan Kirby talks about, and this happens when the postmodern phase itself is passé. There's also a new term which is being used, postmodernism, and it refers to a wide-ranging set of developments which are emerging from and reacting to postmodernism. Here we also find a certain kind of pattern being replicated in these theoretical formulations, just like postmodernism responded and reacted to the limitations of modernism. We find postmodernism responding and reacting and also emerging from certain limitations which are there in postmodernism. And this has also been the result of the belief that postmodernism has now gone out of fashion, and what follows is also a series of proposed designations and none part of mainstream usage yet. So, accordingly, we do not have a particular term to refer to when we are talking about postmodernism. We only have a series of proposals and a series of scattered discourses to refer to. I consider it extremely useful to revisit an older essay, a 1967 essay by John Barth titled Literature of Exhaustion. We've already referred to this a couple of times earlier, and this essay was a very influential and controversial essay at the outset of the postmodern phase, and this also was useful in defining and redefining the tenets of modernism and postmodernism in the 1960s. Barth made this very controversial argument that realism had just about run out of usefulness, and that the writers after 1960 had inherited only exhausted and outworn resources. As a result of this exhaustion, that a new kind of postmodern metafiction had come into place. A pervasive self-reflexivity was an offshoot of this exhaustion which had come about in the 1960s. It will be a useful exercise to try and see how John Barth's 1967 essay Literature of Exhaustion also gives us an entry point to talk about Gibbon's essay. When Gibbons talks about the end of postmodernism, he is also referring to a certain way in which some of the devices which postmodernism had offered had become outdated and had become not so useful in the last few decades. To quote from Gibbon's essay, with the end of postmodernism's playfulness and affectation, we are better placed to construct a literature that engages earnestly with world's problems. This new literature can, in good faith, examine complex and ever-shifting crises of racial inequality, capitalism and climate change, to which it is easy to close one's eyes. Just like Barth had drawn our attention to the outworn resources of realism in the 1960s, we have Gibbon now drawing our attention to the outwornness of playfulness and affectation, which are also characteristic of much of postmodern writings. And he also points out that maybe we need to move away towards a different kind of narrative, towards a different kind of framework itself to engage earnestly with world's problems, such as the ones related to race, to capitalism and also about environmentalism. Having said that, it would be appropriate to talk about two major novels which were published in the year 2014. One by Ben Lerner, an American novelist. The novel was titled 10-4, and the other one by Nell Zick, yet another American writer, and her novel was titled The Wall Creeper. Ben Lerner's novel 10-4 spoke about ecological disaster, and Nell Zick spoke about environmental terrorism. And both these novels also vigorously reasserted the idea of the self, which had gone out of vogue in the postmodern writings. And most of the reviewers and the critics were at a loss as to how to label and categorize these two novels, Ben Lerner's 10-4 and Nell Zink's The Wall Creeper. The kind of novel that they wrote was neither fiction nor non-fiction, but a flickering between them, as Ben Lerner would call it. And some reviewers also were of the opinion that this was an emergent new class of memoiristic, autobiographical and metafictional novels, and some of them also chose to label it as autofiction. It's important to reiterate that they resisted to be categorized as postmodern. And that is also the interesting turning point that postmodernism has reached today. And what is autofiction? In Jonathan Sturgeon's 2014 paper, The Death of Postmodern Novel and the Rise of Autofiction, he tries to give kind of a definition to autofiction, and he also begins with this disclaimer that the robust fictional project of Pynchon, Don DeLillo and Coover no longer holds sway over literary writing. So he begins by, just like the postmodern project had begun by completely displacing the grand narratives associated with modernism, here we find the postmodern autofiction beginning to displace certain authorities who had held sway over literary writing in the postmodern space. Jonathan Sturgeon also attempts to define autofictions. According to him, by this I mean that the self is no longer drowned in a system of disinformation, paranoia and entropy in the vein of Pynchon and DeLillo. Nor does the self get washed away in an ocean of hyperreality or unreality in the Baudrillardian style of ballad. Nor is it beholden to the logic of late capitalism, at least not entirely. We are witnessing instead the induction of a new class of memoiristic, autobiographical and metafictional novels, we can call them autofictions, that jettison the logic of postmodernism in favor of a new position. To see how the label of postmodernism is not applied to these two novels, it's also important to know how they resist being postmodernist. According to Sturgeon, again, in these novels, the oeuvre is the soul. And we also have seen how the self makes a comeback in these writings, how the self is being privileged over all the other things. And I again read to you from Sturgeon. The new class of autofictions, having passed through modernism's Joycean and Proustian portraits of artists, as well as the defined relativism of postmodernism and post-structuralist theory, eschews the entire truth versus fiction debate in favor of the question of how to live or how to create. We find that the very set of things that postmodernism resisted makes a comeback in these contemporary fiction. There is also a going back, a reclaiming of the self, a going back to the soul, and while they continue to experiment with the narrative techniques, they also reject the models which were made available to them through the phases of modernism and postmodernism. And one of them also had pointed out that pastiche also had gone out of vogue in the contemporary because they no longer find it important to rely on the previous techniques even to parody or to subvert. While one cannot categorically state that the moment of postmodernism has already gone by or it has been displaced by other kinds of writing, it's also important to know the scope and relevance of autofiction in the contemporary. I read to you again from the essay by Sturgeon. The current tendency toward autofiction, as Criss-Cross has recently suggested, may have been foreshadowed or even inaugurated by queer and women writers in the 1990s. I am inclined to think she is right. In both cases, there is a vitality of self in excess of systems, of control, capital, information, whatever that cuts against postmodern fiction. Yet the rise or return of autofiction isn't the work of a movement, a campaign or vanguard. It is more of a murmur in the heart of the novel, one that lets us know that literature is alive, still forming a living hypothesis. There was a point in time when there was a concerted effort to cut against modernist fiction. We find the same getting replicated, at least in minimal ways, in certain parts of the Western world in the contemporary. As we begin to wind up this course, it's also important to recall some of the seminal foundational aspects related to postmodernism. That there is no consensus about what postmodernism means or what it does. And this is something that we have been noting right from the outset of this course, that this is a concept, that this is a phenomenon which defies all kinds of definitions and resists all kinds of categorizations. The absolute absence of any kind of consensus is also an interesting problematic which would not allow us to conclude the event of postmodernism in any which way. One is still wondering whether postmodernism can be defined as a cultural logic of late capitalism, or as the loss of historicity, or as a subversion of meta-narratives, or the fascination with the ontological, or even the celebration of fragmentation and multiplicity. And all of these definitions, all of these concepts do together also refer to this mega event, this mega phase known as postmodernism. A brief discussion may not perhaps be enough to state whether the moment of postmodernism is over or we are still living in the postmodern phase or not. And I also take this opportunity to take a quick inventory of the various ways in which postmodern debates have been shaped up through a discussion of different genres, different theories, and also different kinds of literature. In the beginning of the course, we spoke about the intersections between art, architecture, literature, and culture, and how they continue to inform each other especially in the postmodern phase. We spoke about the modernist impulses, which also had a bearing on the way postmodernism began to emerge, and we noted the post-structuralist turning points which were exemplified in the works of Foucault and Barthes, and later we also took a look at the influences from the Western theorists, particularly the ones by Lyotard, Derrida and Baudrillard. They also spoke about the incredulity toward meta-narratives, about deconstruction, and also about hyperreality. Those were also useful concepts to talk about postmodern literature and also postmodern culture, as we have noted. And we engaged with the ideas foregrounded by Julia Kristeva, Donna Haraway and Judith Butler. We also saw how gender and feminism can also be incorporated as one of the elements in our discussions of postmodernism, though there were also critiques which were widely prevalent. We also spoke about how the postmodern moment can be redefined through an intervention of the post-colonial criticisms. We engaged with Bhabha, Kwame Appiah and Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, and we also took a look at how deconstruction can be employed in certain literary texts. Deleuze and Guattari's discussions on minor literature and about rhizomes were useful in engaging with certain texts. At the same time, we also did see how Eagleton, Jameson and Chomsky offered a very radically different critique of postmodernism. Here we also need to mention Habermas, who also argued that the project of modernity has not yet been over and postmodernity needs to be accessed, needs to be talked about in keeping that in mind. And talking about the postmodern literature, we took a look at a range of texts written by different literary icons ranging from Toni Morrison, Margaret Atwood, Don DeLillo, Jean Rhys, William Faulkner, John Fowles, Lawrence Stern, Salman Rushdie, Borges, W.G. Sebald, Ishmael Reed, Marquez, Allen Ginsberg and Thomas Pynchon. Though this is not a very comprehensive, extensive list, we did try to engage with the idea of postmodernism as it is reflected in literature in rather in-depth ways. As we come to the end of this course, it also becomes very important to reiterate this idea that postmodernism frustrates our desire for closure at the end. And for the same reason, we do not attempt to do the same for this course either. I also leave you with a very useful observation made by Matthew Mullins in his 2017 work, Postmodernism in Pieces. He makes this very insightful observation. If the open-endedness of these conclusions is effected in language that is resolutely material, then what becomes clear is that we are left not with some precocious ambiguity or lack of direction, but with the materials we need to account for the ongoing formation, reformation, and transformation of the networks formed through reading. I hope this is useful for us to evaluate and to access postmodernism, even when historically the period is passé, or even when historically the period is over, as some of them argue it to be. And on that note that opens up multiple possibilities for reading and interpretation, we also begin to wrap up this course, Postmodernism in Literature. I hope this NPTEL course, Postmodernism in Literature, did offer a great learning experience and opportunity for you. Thank you for listening and thank you for being a part of this course.